Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Billy Wilder Theater. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum, and I'm very delighted to welcome you all to today's talk by art historian John Walsh. Today is part one of a series of 4 talks called Matisse's Surprises. We all know Henri Matisse is one of the world's most famous and beloved artists, and in 2026 is shaping up to be a landmark year for Matisse. With several major retrospectives and unique thematic shows scheduled across Europe and the United States. Many of these exhibitions are focusing on his later years and his revolutionary cutout technique, which we will hear about in the 4th lecture. In Paris, a massive retrospective featuring over 230 works, including paintings, drawings, and his famous cutouts, will open in March in the newly renovated Grand Palais. Madrid is showing Chez Matisse, the legacy of a new painting, in March. SF MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the Centre Pompidou in South Korea will all have major Matisse exhibitions this year. But our Hammer audience will get a jump start on the year of Matisse with these 4 talks tracing Matisse's work over the arc of his life by renowned art historian John Walsh. Walsh came to Los Angeles in 1983 to be director of the Getty Museum, having been a paintings curator at the Metropolitan and at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. His 17-year project of strengthening the Getty collection and its staff and building an entirely new museum concluded with his retirement 25 years ago. Actually, I think it's 26 now. But he likes it here in LA, so he stayed, and when not traveling around the world as a freelance art historian, researching great works of art and preparing for presentations like this one, we get to hear about all of his research, and as we are today. His PhD in art history and academic reputation have led to teaching part-time at Yale and giving public lectures there and other places, including here at the Hammer. His art history lecture series on European and American art are now available in around 60 videos, all available for free online, including on the Hammer channel. And at last report, these videos have been viewed by more than 1 million people. In today's talk, called Exactitude is Not Truth, Matisse Breaks Through, Walsh will talk about how the young Matisse was seduced by light and color on the Riviera and pushed them to new extremes in landscapes, figure drawings, and still lifes. The following 3 talks will be on January 25th, February 8th, and February 22nd. So I'd like to invite you all to come back on January 25th to learn about the next phase of Matisse's life. Walsh has also prepared a reading list, which you may have received on your way in, and if you didn't, you can receive it on your way out. It includes additional resources for those of you who'd like to take an even deeper dive into the scholarship about Matisse. And after today's talk, we'd love for you to join us for coffee, tea, and cookies out in the theater lobby, and John will be happy to take questions out there. This lecture series is part of our commitment to bring world-class scholarship to our visitors. I'm certain you'll agree after today that John Walsh's deep expertise and passion for Matisse will be an extraordinary exploration of one of modernism's greatest artists. Programming like this is made possible by our members, whose support allows us to present exceptional lectures, exhibitions, and educational programs throughout the year. So I want to thank our Hammer members and supporters who are out there in the audience today. And for those of you who enjoyed today's program, we'd love to invite you to join the Hammer community as a member. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Walsh.
Hello, everybody, and Claudia, thank you. Thank you for giving the audience the reasons why they should pay attention to Matisse. Even if it's an introduction for you, I hope it's useful. Whatever it is, there are surprises, I think, even if you do know the artist. Henri Matisse shares credit for pioneering modern painting with Picasso and Mondrian and Kandinsky. In these 4 lectures, I'm going to take you through all 60 years of Matisse's career, looking closely at a lot of his work, in the hope that you'll want to go and see for yourselves. You'll see from Claudia how many opportunities there are. He was enormously productive. He's been studied by a generation of writers, and so there is a huge and excellent literature about Matisse that I've depended on in writing up that little suggestion to you about important titles and links to visual stuff. You'll have it on the website if you don't have it on paper. In any case, I want to start today in the year 1906, when Matisse was already 36 years old. He's off to a relatively delayed start, but kind of an explosive one, when he showed this large painting in the Salon d'Automne. This was an annual exhibition of contemporary art where surprises were expected, but this one was a shocker. It was strange and in just about every way, even to a Paris audience that had been jolted by new art for about 40 years or so. This was the same year that Paul Cézanne died, and his late masterpiece here was exhibited in the autumn, this assemblage of nude bathers in the landscape, which Matisse could go and inspect and admire, and in which the 24-year-old Spaniard Pablo Picasso could also inspect and respond to with his own group of brazen and worrying nude prostitutes. We'll be back to this picture by Matisse of 1906, but I want to start with something entirely different, a picture that took me by surprise when I was a student. It's a picture that he painted in the same year, 1906. This still life, which is less than 2 feet high. I'd like to have a leisurely look at it with you, with just a few details. We can take it in pretty quickly. A tabletop with lemons, a melon in the middle, some small green things, and 2 ceramic bowls. And there's a white plaster statue of a young woman. Behind that, there are flowers, some pink and red blossoms and green leaves. In the center, near the top, there's a little cluster of white stabs with the brush that might be a flower, abbreviated, or cut loose from the bouquet. All of this in an interior space that's just suggested, not spelled out. The right-hand quarter of the picture could suggest a translucent blue curtain that partly reveals a hot red vertical patch of something beyond. And down on the table, if we try to trace the table edges, we can do okay for a while until they disappear behind the statue and the melon, where we encounter a kind of purple cloud. That's where we would expect the vase that holds the flowers. But instead, there's a floating purple zone. And that's just the beginning of the floating patches of color that occur in the top third of the picture and can't really be recognized. They function like the blossoms. The patches play around behind the white plaster statue, and they caress its edges, and they peep out in between her arm and her side. So some things in the picture we can identify, some not. They're abstracted forms. They add color and variety and life to the image. Matisse is credited with saying about painting, exactitude is not truth. As for the flowers and the missing vase, I think another painting by Matisse, the one on the right, was based on the same setup, but it's focused on the bouquet. In the left-hand painting, that bouquet is upstaged by the fruit and the statue. And Matisse has given it a kind of muted, slightly grayer tonality. And there's a reason for all this. Matisse used this flower piece as part of the setup for the other picture to help visualize what Matisse would have seen here at the right, thanks to some digital magic, is his finished flower piece, as though Matisse had propped it up behind the table. And that was the basis for the painting at the left. A little game of appearances. And you'll see not just the first kind of deception in Matisse's work. A few things here we can recognize in other paintings of the period. The tablecloth with the black center also serves as a hanging on the wall in the middle picture, which is much bigger. And there's the melon. At the right, the red and black cloth again, back on the table with the same cup and spoon. He paints it from above, tilting it at you at a steep angle and floating in no place that we can recognize. The statue is a piece that he'd been working on recently in plaster. He hadn't yet cast it in bronze. We'll see that Matisse put great energy for much of his life studying nude models in drawings in clay and plaster. He's going to subject them to all kinds of exaggerations and abbreviations, here very gentle ones, based on his hands-on knowledge of anatomy. He puts her at the edge of the picture but pulls her into the composition with lots of diagonals that rhyme with the stems and the leaves. Her long, narrow shape balances the vertical shapes on the far right. And Matisse thought all of this through with great, great care. By including a plaster cast in his still life paintings, Matisse was following a tradition. This is Cézanne, a table with fruit and statuette by a 17th century sculptor. And as for flowers, Matisse was joining, of course, a long lineage in French art. Flower pieces were a challenge to composition and color, as well as a pretty reliable source of income. Artists were urged to study pictures in the Louvre, where there were lots of great examples like these from the 17th and 18th century. The grand bouquet on the left by the Dutch painter Jan van Huysum, carefully painted melee of flowers in a state of decline, or the bright bouquets of Valet Coster in the middle, or at the right, the much more vigorous brushwork that Delacroix applied to blossoms. Painters of the generation of before Matisse, like Monet and Renoir, became much more adventuresome in their compositions. And in the middle, Odillon Redon made intensely colored arrangements and painted them mainly in pastel. And actually, Matisse had bought one of these by Redon 6 years earlier. These are all by Matisse in the same time as our still life. So he was using flower pieces as a kind of testing ground, not just for color, but for painting techniques. At the far left here, a pointillist application of painting. In the center, a kind of suggestive fluidity. And the bouquet at the right, you saw a moment ago, forcefully saturated colors. There were some quirky still lifes too. The most surprising being the one on the right here, trying out a kind of faux naive simplicity with folk-like ceramics and downstage a cast of sprouting onions. In this summer of 1906, the year of all these experiments with still life, Matisse was established in the eyes of the traditionalists as a radical, a danger to art. The newest leader in the progressive destruction of traditional values of discipline and faithfulness to nature. A menace, like Cézanne and Gauguin and Seurat. The year before, he and some friends had exhibited paintings that pushed color so far that a half-joking critic called them fauve, wild beasts. So this has been a little preview. I want to step back now and see how it is that Matisse got to this point. He was born in 1869, and he grew up in the town of Bouin, at the upper left, where the blue arrow is, 90 miles north of Paris, 25 miles from the Belgian border, in the gently rolling flatlands of the French Flanders, where people grew sugar beets and worked in factories weaving cloth. This was a time of rapid change and industrialization, especially after the military defeat of France by the Germans in 1870. Matisse's father was a hardworking, prosperous seed merchant with a demanding personality. And Matisse said about his mother, "She loved everything I did." She encouraged his painting as a child, and he drew in sketchbooks and took violin lessons, designed and operated a toy theater. And much later, he remembered traveling fairs and how he wanted to perform like the actors and the musicians he'd seen. After all, he said about himself later, an artist is an exhibitionist. He wasn't much of a student. At 12, he was sent away to school, but in 1887 left, suffering from colitis. At 17, he proposed to his parents that he study law at the Sorbonne. He did, and he said, the law was Hebrew to me. So he came back to town to serve as a law clerk, not successfully. It was boring in Bouin, commercially accessible, unbeautiful. The weather was lousy often. The cheerful picture down there in the lower right with the tour bus shows the Matisse family shop and house, serving these days as a shrine. Matisse was happy to get away, but he never lost his taste for textiles, his love for them, the main product of the town and the region, which made the place famous. Every kind of patterned silk and velvet in profusion, luxury fabrics that supplied the couture houses of Paris. His excellent biographer, Hilary Sperling, is convinced that Matisse's growing up with textiles all around him helped to give him a taste for them, the ones that we see in his own paintings later on. There wasn't much else for his visual imagination in his hometown. Sperling makes it clear that late adolescence for Matisse was a great trial. He was a victim of the repressive sexual conventions of the time and place. Respectable girls were distant and unavailable. He had fantasies of odalisques, who weren't to be had either. He struggled with his father. He was sick again, much worse than before. When his mother brought him a paint box, he saw an alpine landscape on it, and he describes what happened. He said, "From the moment I held the box of colors in my hand, I knew this was my life. Like an animal that plunges headlong toward what it loves, I dived in, to the understandable despair of my father, who had made me study quite different subjects. It was a tremendous attraction, a sort of paradise found, in which I was completely free, at peace." So Matisse taught himself to paint and went on to the local free art classes. When he announced to his family that he was going to be an artist, his father refused to think of such a thing. When his teachers interceded, he got a grudging stipend from his father, with the equivalent of $20 a month, for a trial period. And in October 1891, with two friends, he took the train to Paris. He had an introduction to William Bouguereau, the leading academic artist of the time, who was rich and famous and skillful and slick. Bouguereau sent him to the Académie Julian, a kind of prep school for the Academy of Fine Arts, and he drew copies of casts, plaster casts, and for the first time ever, he worked from nude models. This practice of life drawing was the foundation of his entire career as an artist, he insisted later. At the time, he said that what he saw in himself was a failure as an art student, but that a visit to the museum in Lille changed him. When I saw the Goyas in Lille, he wrote, that was where I understood that painting could be a language. I thought I could be a painter. He didn't get admitted to the Academy, but he did catch the attention of Gustave Moreau, who was encouraging to him and invited Matisse to become his student in his own atelier, where he studied for 6 more years. Now, Moreau was close to the end of his career as the greatest French painter of the symbolist movement. What you see here is Moreau's 13-foot-high scene from the climax of the epic when Odysseus returns to kill the suitors for Penelope, which he struggled with on and off for 40 years. Here's a sketch by Matisse of a life class. Moreau was an eccentric, curmudgeonly man, but honest as a teacher. He was the first who actually inspired Matisse, who wrote that Moreau didn't set pupils on the right track, he took them off it. He made them uneasy, said Matisse. Other teachers stuck to the studio, but Moreau took his pupils to the Louvre and became what we would call a gallery teacher, looking at paintings, discussing them one by one. They copied as well paintings, and Moreau coached them. He didn't show us how to paint, said Matisse. He roused our imaginations in front of the life he found in these paintings. In the Louvre, Matisse copied paintings by Chardin. Moreau had recommended them to him and told him, be sure to note one thing, which is that color has to be thought, has to be passed through the imagination. If you have no imagination, you'll never produce beautiful color. And he said, this is Moreau still, the painting that lasts is the one that has been thought about, dreamed over, reflected on, produced from mind, and not just from the facility at dabbing on highlights with the tip of the brush. And that was a lesson that stuck with Matisse all his life and shaped his art. What gives painting life isn't facility with the brush, but the strength of the artist's engagement with the subject. Matisse was keeping well clear of Impressionism, and the art of capturing fleeting effects of light and shade in favor of still study and discipline. Still life, Chardin's specialty, let him see and reveal the structure of composition without its small details. Moreau sent him to copy this huge Dutch still life on the right, and he never forgot it. He came back to it several more times. And 20 years later, during a prolonged test of whether he could adapt to Cubism, Matisse painted an enormous composition based on the Duhem one that he'd seen long before. We're going to come back to that picture after a while. In 1894, he could afford to move to a rundown building on the Seine with a view to the river. He had a studio for himself and a room for his companion, Camille Jobou, and their new baby called Marguerite, who would be important to him for more than 60 years. There, he had some success. 5 paintings that he'd submitted to the jury of the Salon de la Nationale in 1896 were accepted, and the one on the left was actually bought by the French state. This small sort of tidy composition of Camus, seen from the back in a corner filled with bric-a-brac. Nicely balanced, all seen in diffuse light, all sensitively painted with mild colors. It's about the security of the familiar and the quiet pleasure of the known and the reliable. Its style doesn't give the slightest hint of Matisse's work to come, but the domestic subject matter was going to be central to his art. Visiting the coast of Brittany the following summer, he painted this picture of a plain interior with a view out the door to a dazzling exterior. This was a motif for years afterward. The artist inside in a kind of protected zone and suggesting the boundless outside. This was the first of his 2 visits to islands that were going to change his life as a painter. First to Belle-Île off the Brittany coast, that's the blue circle, and where the artists of several generations had been coming in the summertime. And then in the following year, in the Mediterranean, to Corsica, down at the lower right in red. On Belle-Île, with his little family, Matisse broadened and loosened his way of painting. At the left, black and white almost have become technicolor in the middle. After just a couple of months, a fellow artist who'd known Matisse as a conservative, mainly tonal painter, came to see him that summer, and he wrote, "Oh, surprise, I found him at his window making a little study of the view across the harbor." His palette was now based on cobalt blue and crimson madder lake. There was no trace left of the blended, restrained, and somber tones he'd favored until now. The design was set down with pure colors. Matisse has set out intrepidly on the new road that had so much frightened me. The small oil sketches here at the right are in a higher key than before, and he's painting them much more freely. Indoors, at the left, he makes a kind of tribute to Chardin out of the stuff on the table, and the graceful role of the maidservant, all in a lighter, brighter vein. Matisse gave credit for this change to a man called John Peter Russell, a well-known Australian emigre painter who lived on the island. Russell was generous and exuberant and introduced him to Claude Monet's idea about color and light and their relationships. Monet had come out to the island 10 years earlier to visit Russell and had taught him a lot. Russell painted the picture in the middle from almost the same vantage point that Monet had chosen for his own picture at the right, which is a showcase for his technique of evoking light and shade with repeated broken strokes of contrasting and complementary colors. When he came back the following summer, Matisse was in full Impressionist mode. In the middle, working with short strokes and lavender hues, and at the left, weaving long colored strokes for the water and the cliffs. Back in Paris, his teacher Moreau had urged him to make a major painting for the Salon of the Société Nationale of 1897. Matisse had been elected a member and had decided to exhibit this large still life with a maid at a table, laden with glass and silver and fruit and flowers. The more conservative members didn't like it a bit, thinking he'd gone over to the other side, to the Impressionists. But in fact, Matisse had seen very little of the Impressionists at that point, or of the Post-Impressionists either, Cézanne and Seurat and Gauguin. But one of the pioneer Impressionists, the venerable Camille Pissarro, told him the advice that Corot had given to him. "Very good, my friend, you are gifted. Work, and don't listen to anything anyone tells you." Still, Pissarro told Matisse to go and see the Turner paintings in London, he and Matisse went together to the Luxembourg Palace, also to see the exhibition of paintings by Impressionists that had been collected by Gustave Caillebotte. They saw these paintings. Monet, at his most original and most powerful and suggestive, and what they suggested to Matisse took him quite some years to digest. After his relationship with his partner deteriorated, he met and married a woman from Toulouse called Amélie Parère, a person of substance and education and energy. She became the mother of the two boys, his two boys, their two boys, the stepmother of Marguerite, one of his models. She became also the manager of his business and his closest confidant. Their honeymoon seems to have been something of a business trip for Matisse, first to London to take Pissarro's advice and see the paintings by Turner for the first time. Matisse put down his thoughts about Turner and light. He said, "It's always a good thing to begin with renunciation, to impose a regime of abstinence on yourself from time to time." Turner lived in a cellar. Once a week he had the shutters suddenly flung open, and then what incandescence, what dazzlement, what jewels. Their next stop was Corsica, at the time a wild and remote place with blazing sun and tropical plants that he'd never seen before. Something of Turner's radiance had become part of him. He made more than 50 small oil sketches on Corsica that have a kind of abandon in the brushwork, all rejoicing in the colors and the shapes. Years later, he wrote, "I decided to allow myself a year's respite. I wanted to reject all restraint and paint as it seemed best to me. Before long, there came to me, like a revelation, a love of the materials of painting for their own sake. Growing within me, I felt the passion of color. That passion for color lies behind a series of still lifes at the turn of the century. They push beyond what he'd done before. They test the possibilities for brushwork and color. They begin here, with this diagonal arrangement of fruits and glasses and bowls on a tablecloth. This time, there's a flush of warm yellow light on the wall that makes a kind of confetti of yellow and blue and spots, each of them a stroke or a dab of the brush. It's picked up here and there, even in the cool blue-gray left side. 2 years earlier, in the picture you saw, he'd painted the whole setup more or less completely and carefully. In the orange still life, things are suggested more than described, and the play of light and shade is more subtle. And then a new experiment, going all the way to dots, now fully pointillist. This was a technique he'd been seeing other painters use. Just to remind you, the public debut of the technique had been a dozen years earlier, at the Salon of the Independence of 1886, demonstrated by Georges Seurat on a 10-foot canvas at the cost of vast labor. He was enacting an observation based on color theory that you could get a more true-to-life rendition of light and shade by using small, uniform dots and short strokes of contrasting and sometimes complementary colors, separate, rather than mixing them on the palette. Seurat very quickly had followers, several of whom Matisse knew, particularly the elderly and open-minded Pissarro, who put aside his Impressionist style and adopted the next big thing, soon to be named Divisionism or Neo-Impressionism. For a while, Vincent van Gogh did the same thing. a year into his stay at Paris. But he didn't have the patience for applying a sea of little dots. So he allowed himself dashes too. And pretty soon the dashes grew and he quit the dots. This stippled way of working did a good job of capturing the dazzle of Mediterranean sunlight. And several younger contemporaries of Matisse practiced it. This is Paul Signac at the right and Henri Cross at the left. In just a few years, Matisse was going to join them in working this way for a while. Meanwhile, Matisse's still lifes didn't need a rigorous system to break down the reflected light into small contrasting bits. In the painting on the right, he used color juxtaposition in his own way. Here in the wall on the left and on the door. In the composition, of course, he was giving a graceful bow to Cézanne on the left, the greatest master of still life of his time. Cézanne not only gave Matisse a model for his subjects like this, but he gave permission to tilt tabletops and to do puzzling things with the edges and with space, like the napkin and the strange right side of the picture here. It's hard to know what we're looking at in the Cézanne. Logic seems suspended. Linear perspective and gravity are out. How is that straw basket supported anyway? And at the far right, what's the wooden leg? How come the floor tilts up so sharply? The painter's taking liberties to suggest more and to create visual relationships within the picture. This is poetic license. Matisse does the same thing with his saturated blues and orange and reds and greens. Cézanne's work had a profound effect on Matisse in other ways too. In that same year, he used some of his new wife's inheritance to buy this small painting of bathers, which remained a kind of talisman for him, as you'll see. Several years after Cézanne painted that painting of three bathers, Bouguereau, the celebrated academician and the teacher Matisse almost had, exhibited these bathers just to suggest the gap here. These bathers at the Salon, where decorum still ruled. Matisse also managed to buy a plaster version of this bust by Rodin, the greatest sculptor alive. It's a portrait of the radical writer Rochefort, shown speaking, his wild hair acting out his mental energy, which Rodin emphasizes with a lot of spontaneous, rough modeling. Matisse was doing sculpture himself at the time. He was drawing and painting live models in the evening at a studio with other artists. Here is an Italian model called Bevilacqua, who had posed for Rodin too. Matisse painted his torso as a kind of assemblage of flat planes, Cézanne-like, but even more accentuated, and with edges and colors like no other painters, blue and pink and deep red, reinforcing a mood of patient submission that the legs and the curvature of the back express too. Rodin had made this life-size piece around the same time using legs from the same model. Matisse's bronze at the right is called The Serf, robust but downcast. He leaves the muscles roughly modeled the way plaster sketches are, but Matisse's piece is finished. It's meant to be seen as we see it now in bronze. He was drawing and modeling females too. He used a broad-nibbed pen at the left, rapidly and sort of urgently. The study in oil in the middle of a more slender model is gracefully complex in its pose and probably the basis for the bronze on the far right, which is 2 feet high. Matisse insisted that sculpture was the way fully to understand a figure. An outline drawing might be helpful, but real comprehension came not from looking and drawing, but also from shaping material with your hands. The drawing up there is a copy of the bronze to the left by the great animal sculptor Antoine Barré of a jaguar who's caught an unlucky jackrabbit. Matisse drew several views of it and then made the plaster replica at the bottom, which he's sent out to be copied in bronze. This kind of outline drawing became a specialty of Matisse, as we're going to see. With his pen, Matisse responded to his own reaction to subjects. When he drew in the Louvre after a violent subject by one of his heroes, Delacroix, he attacked the paper with a kind of furious energy of his own. Working at home, he put models in front of mirrors. At the left, he painted her from behind at an angle so that we get a bit of reflection and a lot of her back. Mirrors and women's backs will become a theme for him. At the right, he put the model on a stand facing him so we see the artist and the model. These mirror images were Impressionist territory, and Matisse knew how to go there with terrific confidence in his own vision, plus his own solid technique with paint. As he turned 30, Matisse was painting and exhibiting and selling, not getting much money, but getting respect. In 1901, he was elected to the Society of Independent Artists, the collective of Cézanne and Gauguin and Toulouse-Lautrec and Pissarro and others who'd broken in 1884 with the official salon system and its conservative juries in favor of open admission to its exhibitions. A financial scandal in his wife's family brought Matisse and his wife and 3 children back north to Beaune to live for a couple of years. In general, life there was miserable, without much artistic progress, and a lot of discouragement. But Matisse kept working. But Matisse kept working. The most poignant thing he painted was this. In his dim, chilly studio in the attic, there's an easel, a painting, palette, and a few flowers in a tiny vase. Out the window is a bright sunshine landscape, flowers, a scene of blazing light and color. It's a picture of isolation, poverty, and the allure of another life for the artist. In 1904, things turned better. The discerning Paris dealer Ambroise Vollard gave to Matisse his first one-man exhibition, and Matisse went to spend the summer at Saint-Tropez, close to where his new friend Paul Signac was living. Matisse reveled in the delicious summer light. Here at the left, the sunshine slashes across the terrace of Signac's house and leaves his wife Amélie in delicate shadow. She's wearing a Japanese kimono, and she bends over her needlework. This combination of warmth and opulence and domestic peace was going to be a theme for him ever after. Many of you have been to the Gardner Museum, and like me, you didn't notice what's up there over the door. That's the painting we just seen. The light is good, though, and the thieves didn't bother with it in 1990. The attraction of Saint-Tropez for Matisse, apart from the weather, was Paul Signac himself, who was 6 years older and well-established. Signac inherited the informal leadership of the so-called neo-impressionists or divisionists from Seurat after his death in 1890. You saw the Grand Jatte just a minute ago and some works by Pissarro and Van Gogh in that style. Matisse admired Signac and his success enough to study his technique up close and adopt it, or not. Matisse first painted the town with an eye conditioned by Cézanne, as he had done with still life. His mentor, Signac, saw things differently and encouraged Matisse to try again, to apply contrasting dots of color patiently. Signac's spots of color were a little more varied in shape than Seurat's, but they're similar in the way he used blue and red to create luminous lavender shadows. You can see in this big detail that there's very little drawing, apparently. It's mostly masses of yellow and red and blue spots, varying in density for different degrees of light and dark, and varying in color, creating color zones by method of optical mixing in our brains. Proto-pixels, you could call them. You saw Matisse try this in still lifes 5 years earlier, but it didn't come naturally to him. What did come naturally is this: a more traditional kind of sketching in oil with patches made of bigger strokes of particular colors that gave him an animated paint surface, impulsive looking, with bigger zones of saturated color. This suited his temperament, but it evidently annoyed and alienated Signac. The composition of his wife and younger son here, by the sea at sunset, was the starting point of a bigger project, a test for Matisse, an ambitious figure composition using his own version of neo-impressionism. The next step towards that was a small oil sketch for a scene set on the same bluff overlooking the Gulf of Saint-Tropez, but now introducing a quartet of female bathers standing, sitting, reclining. In the detail, you see the mother is there, the woman robed in blue, his wife Amélie, who's set out a white cloth for tea. A small child is there, standing in the middle. A sailing vessel has arrived, of a type that Mediterranean fishermen had used since ancient Roman times. We're somewhere between modern life and an imaginary classical antiquity. In fact, in a place where for centuries artists' imaginations had been dwelling. Recently, it was Signac who had painted this spectacular composition 9 years before called In the Time of Harmony, 13 feet wide. It's an allegory of the future when anarchy will have changed everything. Like a lot of artists in his circle, Signac was an anarchist, but of a philosophical bent rather than agitator or a bomb thrower. And the title was originally In the Time of Anarchy, not Harmony, which he believed would be a good time. And this was the Mediterranean coast of the future, after the government would be overthrown and the formerly oppressed people would have leisure to spend in sunshine and shade, with figs and flowers free for the picking. Liberated workers would dance in a circle, and down by the shore, painters would paint. When he got back to Paris, Matisse made the much larger version of the composition on the left. You might compare it with a study. Then I'll show you the large one again, and the detail of it. And now I'm going to be quiet for just a moment while you look. Matisse was making a major statement. His title, Luxe, Calme et Volupté, was from Baudelaire, the last line of the refrain of his Invitation to the Voyage, one of the most familiar poems of the age, addressed to a lover, suggesting that she come away with him, and they live together là-bas in the southern land of luxury and warmth, delight and beauty. It's a utopia for hedonist escapists, you might say. The picture's almost 4 feet wide, and it made a very big impression when he exhibited it in the autumn of the following year. Matisse produces half-tones not with small dots of contrasting color that merge in your brain, but here and there with large spots and dashes at wider intervals. He creates highlights at the edges of the nudes at the right by using chains of faint yellow spots. In the center, he accentuates the edges by using clotted red spots to outline them, giving a weird kind of aura to them. And he cheats in places, reverting to the blue linear outlines in several figures. Matisse found this system hard to use consistently, though, and pretty soon he gave it up. He looked back at this period and commented on divisionism and pointillism and his liberation from it, saying that he overthrew the tyranny of divisionism. One can't live in a household that's too well kept if the house is kept by aunties from the countryside. Still, when it was shown at the Independence exhibition in 1905, it got a lot of attention. Matisse had revived the ancient theme with energy and verve. Signac himself bought the picture for a princely 1,000 francs. That summer, Matisse painted the same still life setup in the same still life setup in 2 different styles. Kind of experimental take and retake that Matisse did for most of his life. The larger one is in the fluent style he'd brought with him to Saint-Tropez, partly under the influence of Cézanne. The other one is the vivid new one. You might ask yourselves, which do you prefer? Matisse had made a friend a few years earlier in the painting class they had together, André Derain, who was 10 years younger, smart, talented, and headed for an engineering degree. Matisse had steered him to art, and he persuaded Derain to join him and his family the following summer at Collioure, a fishing village near the border of Catalonia. And pretty soon, Derain was painting colorful scenes, full of life, tracking Matisse on his move away from the methods that Signac had shown them both. Here, Derain seizes on the rhythm of the drying sails that are moving back and the jumble of sardine boats on the beach, and he crops the scene tightly. Derain and Matisse actually challenged each other. What if you let the colors tell you what shapes to make and how to combine them? These were big, brash pictures. At the left here, yes. Derain was like Matisse in having an intense and anxious personality. Their companionships seem to have loosened them both up. At any rate, Derain paints his older friend here up at the upper right as contained and serious. But there were jokes. In the middle, Derain shows Matisse bored stiff at the beach, and then next to that makes an arsonist out of him, fleeing the scene. The blazing color is setting the art world on fire. You remember that this picture Matisse made 4 years earlier in the bleak north of France. The bright view out the window suggested that there could be a better life out there, and now Matisse had found it. The brilliant light and color, the warm, moist breezes, all of that gave his senses the chance to open up, let it rip, and let the brush act out his own joy at what was there. And he could float the paint on, too. No need for dots, no need for tidy contours either. Here, it's nap time, a scene that's hard to imagine his painting just a few years earlier. Matisse made many oil sketches on the spot, along the shore and up in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Some are motifs that he had painted on Belle Isle, at least like that, out the left, the sea rumbling into the rocks, and at the center, the scrubby vegetation in the blinding light. And at the right, the arid Mediterranean hills with broom flowering in circling shapes of blue and purple, most of it quickly painted as though it were on impulse. At the spot in the left-hand sketch, Rijn drew Matisse at work on his little easel over at the right, looking down at his very patient wife, Amélie, wearing the Japanese kimono that you saw earlier in Saint-Tropez. The result was Matisse's oil sketch of her sitting on a rock in a whirling mass of orange and purple and green. For the marvelous show a couple of years ago at the Metropolitan on Matisse and Rijn, one of the curators described this sketch very beautifully. She said, "It's hard to distinguish the rock from the mauve and green sea, or the blue undulations on the kimono from the waves that occupy the horizon, against which the silhouette of Amélie, with her deep green chignon, does not stand out clearly. The handling, a matter of strokes, commas, and patches, is utterly free, responding only to the sensations of the painter, gripped, one may imagine, by the secret and unexpected resonance between the lively motives on the kimono and the surging waves." Two views to the town. Rijn at the left, from up higher, Matisse at the right, from down lower. Two canvases of exactly the same size. Look for yourself. You see, Rijn has a clear perspective and structure and emphatic zones of color. He's figured it out. He's made a finished painting. Matisse, on the right, is making a sketch that later on, back in Paris, he might or might not use for a more definitive view. His composition is 1/3 blocked by the level area in the foreground. And for the roofs, he's made a light pencil drawing on the canvas. Into the drawing, he floats many different color patches that suggest rather than spell out what he sees. Is he imitating or inventing? You have to ask. Is he making or is he matching? When he came back to Paris in September, he sent back 100 or so drawings and 40 watercolors, 15 canvases. The canvases, the oil paintings, that is, of that summer have become so famous that it's easy to forget how few finished pictures there were, and that most of what he brought to Paris were studies. We have a lot of those drawings from 1905, and they're just a delight, whether he did them with a brush and a red pen, like the portrait of the shrewd wife on the left of a friend, or just fine pen lines in the quick study at the middle of his daughter, or the simple watercolor in this impression of the mountains at the top, or humble observations like the boats and the chickens. He chose the medium to suit the purpose. That autumn, Matisse made 2 paintings of his wife that were going to demonstrate, when they were put on view, just how far he'd gone to liberate color and brushwork from their conventional descriptive roles. That was a test for the audience in the autumn when he showed these 2 pictures and more at the Salon of the Independents. For some, the thought was, is this poor man out of his mind? A year or 2 earlier, Matisse had been a leading light of the Neo-Impressionists, a well-behaved group of methodical painters. And now he and Derain and others were attacking all of that. One critic saw these paintings by Matisse and others on the wall of Gallery 7 with academic sculptures in the middle of the room and wrote, "It's Donatello among the wild beasts, Donatello parmi les fauves." So they got a nickname, the fauve, for their short-lived movement. After the next couple of years, Matisse and the others moved on in separate directions. But the fallout from the fauve explosion fell not just on French artists, but all over Europe, in Germany and Austria, and Holland and Russia. For Matisse, it was a matter of what he learned and what he had learned to subjects close to hand. Here, close to hand meant daily domestic life on the right, with loose and splashy brushwork, and still life, which you've seen in the picture that we began with its eccentric composition and saturated colors. He was capable of more ambitious setups like this one, more surprising patterns, more outrageous gestures with the brush. We're going to be seeing how his audacious experiments in color and his dreams of a richer life of the senses played out in Matisse's own work in the following year and for the rest of his long life. So please join me to see Matisse take these next steps in the second lecture. Thank you.